Welcome to the Profile Corner. In the last video we talked a bit about tape measures and squares and the accuracy of those devices, comparing foreign-made versions of those tools with domestically made tools that are either made in the United States or in Canada. And we found that there's some oddities with those that are made overseas that may make those tools unusable for you, or may be just okay enough to be used. As pointed out in a comment in the last video, you want to make sure that you're only using one measurement source through your woodworking project if possible. So if you start using one tape measure, keep using that single tape measure throughout the entire project and you'll likely be okay with measurement error. If you mix different measuring devices, you could run into some problems. So if, for instance, you had a foreign-made tape measure and a US-made ruler, you may find that those would measure differently at different distances. So that would make it difficult for you to have nice results in your project. In today's video, we'll be talking about rulers. First, we'll talk about a cheap Westcott ruler that I picked up at Walmart. I did not pick this up for woodworking purposes, but as you can see here, it runs from 0 to 12 inches on the top, and it has metric numbers on the bottom. I checked this out, and it appears as though this is an accurate ruler. One issue with this type of ruler, however, is that the 0 point is not at the end of the ruler. And so that could make it difficult for you to make certain types of measurements. I've got a comparison video that shows this lined up with a Woodpeckers ruler, and all the measurements seem to be dead on accurate. However, there's a bit of a twist in the ruler that's developed. And you see there's a cork backing on it. That warpage may lead to some difficulty for you if you're trying to use this for woodworking projects. It may work just fine. Maybe you can get that flattened out and have it remain flat, but it's developed a curvature since I bought it. Okay, another ruler that you might run across is an old General US-made ruler. This has 32 inch measurements across the top. The end of the ruler is the 0 point on the ruler, and so that means that it'll likely be good for woodworking as long as it's accurate. I've got a video clip showing this in comparison with the Woodpeckers ruler, and I'll show you that now. The old General ruler is harder to read than the Woodpeckers ruler, but all the markings seem to be lining up from end to end. So this seems to be an accurate ruler if you can see the markings accurately. Now, one issue that I had with using this ruler in woodworking projects is that its markings are not very easy to see. Maybe they were easy to see when the ruler was new, but it's tarnished over the years, and so now it's a little bit difficult to read those markings, especially with the light shining on it at different angles. On the back side here, there's some small numbers, but I'm not real sure what those small numbers are supposed to depict because it's so unclear what the writing is on the back side. And several years ago, I also picked up another ruler at a woodworking auction, and I really liked that ruler. However, I haven't been able to find it, and so I've been in search of replacements for that ruler for a while. And these rulers will end up being more accurate than a tape measure as long as you don't need a measurement over 12 inches. And that's because the end of the tape measure usually has a little bit of play in it to allow for inside and outside measurements. In 2023, I picked up a 3-piece ruler set that you can see here. These are clones of Woodpeckers rulers that look almost identical to these. These are inferior to the Woodpeckers rulers, but I bought them thinking that I would like to check out to see if this design format for rulers would be useful for me. One thing I liked about the rulers is that it's fairly easy to read the numbers. There's a clear difference between the white numbers and the red backing, and so that makes it easier to read the ruler. However, it's still not quite as easy to read as what I'd like. I inspected these rulers a couple days ago, comparing them with the Woodpeckers rulers, and I found that there were a few little issues with these rulers. I'll show you a couple of those video clips now that compares these with the Woodpeckers rulers in terms of the measurements. I have an 1/8 inch thick piece of wood under the Woodpeckers ruler to raise it up to the same height as a Violetfox ruler so that we eliminate any risk of parallax read error. The two rulers are butted up against the same board. The Violetfox ruler seems to be off by about 1/64 of an inch, with both rulers butted up against the board. It does seem to get slightly worse as we get out to the 12-inch mark, but it's hard to determine just by eye. The same problem is identified in the 1/16 inch measurements. The Violetfox ruler is about 1/64 of an inch to the left of where the Woodpeckers ruler is at. For the 8-inch ruler, the numbers appear to align up to the 3-inch mark, and they get progressively worse beyond that point, so that out at the 8-inch mark, the Violetfox ruler is about 1/64 of an inch to the left of the Woodpeckers ruler at the same 8-inch mark. The problem with the 8-inch ruler is also seen when comparing to the Woodpeckers 8-inch ruler. If I flip the Violetfox ruler over, it appears that all the markings line up with the Woodpeckers ruler. Obviously, it's not a good sign on a ruler where 1 out of 3 imperial measurement techniques on the ruler does not line up with the other 2. That more or less disqualifies these as being good rulers, because you have to remember which of the imperial measurements are off on these rulers so that you don't use that particular side. It is kind of nice that you're able to flip this over, so if you're using this side here, which has 1/16 of an inch increments, you can flip it over like that and then get to 32nds of an inch measurements. However, if you're using this side of the ruler, which is also 1/16, if you flip it over, then you get the metric measurements, which may not be as handy for you. That said, I really like the design of these rulers. It makes it easy to transfer measurements. So I've got a board here that measures 1 inch in this dimension. And then it measures a different distance across. So if we've got that set, now we've got it set so that the ruler is going to remember that measurement. And I found that that's very handy, so that if I've got 2 tools that need to be set up the same way, I can set up the first tool, and then I can use a ruler like this to transfer those measurements onto the second tool. So in addition to making this short measurement, you can also measure across. There we can see that that's 3 1/8 inches across. I can lock this down, and now the ruler is going to remember that. I don't have this quite lined up here on the end, which is a little bit of an issue with these rulers. So these rulers are almost exactly 1 inch tall. When I measured them, they seem to be about 1/1000 under 1 inch. So they could be used for a measurement block where you need exactly 1 inch tall. These are a little bit thick. They're a little bit over an 1/8 inch thick. They're exactly 4 millimeters as I measured them with my digital caliper. The Woodpeckers version of this ruler is exactly 1/8 of an inch. And so that's a difference, and it also measures exactly 1 inch tall. So you could use these for a setup block in some cases. If we take this off, we can put it into the center, just like so, and then rest it on the table surface, and then we could use the measurements out here on the end. I thought that was a neat feature when I saw it advertised on this ruler. However, in practice, I haven't really used that to make measurements on the table saw. I'll show you that in just a moment here. I've got a video clip showing this being used on the table saw to try to measure the blade height. Rather than using this to measure the blade height, I found that it's much more effective to use setup blocks to make the measurements of the blade height, because then I can just push my finger across the top of those setup blocks to see if the setup block is at exactly the same height as the bit, or that the bit is at exactly the same height as the setup block. And I did find that rulers of this type were useful, and that was the key reason why I bought these. I wanted to see if it was worthwhile to invest in a higher quality version of the rulers from Woodpeckers. And I really liked these a lot, except that I decided I did not like the white markings on the red background. And so I did not buy the aluminum version from Woodpeckers. Also, I did not like that these are so thick, because it leads to parallax errors. If you're not looking at this straight down, you could actually get a measurement off a little bit. Whereas the steel rulers that Woodpeckers sell are thinner than this. They're actually a 1/16 of an inch thick. And so there's less likely to be a parallax error when you're using those thinner rulers. One other thing that I should mention about these rulers is that there's a built-in square that you can use. If you mount these blocks onto the rulers, you can just butt it up against the edge of a board and then scribe across. Now, because this reference edge here is not very long, there's a chance that it'll be off ever so slightly. But if you're just using it for a small square, it might be suitable for that purpose. So I liked the flexibility that these rulers offered and the functionality that's built into them. And so I decided to get the real version from Woodpeckers, and I bought their stainless steel version. So these are the rulers that you've likely seen me use in several of my videos. These are very accurate from what I can determine. They also have height measurements here on the end that could be used for setting up a table saw. I'll show you a quick video clip of that being used. Just like with these Violetfox rulers, I never found that these measurements on the end have been useful for doing setup on tools. I've always preferred to use setup blocks because, once again, I can use my finger to go across that setup block to determine whether or not the blade is at the right height. That's a little bit easier than relying on your vision to see whether or not this line, while it's narrow, is exactly lined up with the top of the bit. Whereas with the setup block, you've got a more precise measurement. So just like those red rulers, you're able to use these as a square in a pinch. I wouldn't rely on them too much for a square, at least not going out much further than this. They do seem to be accurate at short distances. However, when you go out the full 12 inches, this may be off a little bit. I have not verified that's the case, but there's always that chance because this reference edge down here at the bottom is so short. I found that it's very easy to dial these rulers into a specific length, much more so than the red rulers from Violetfox. So I set this ruler at exactly 3 1/8 inches, and that's flush out here on the end of this board. Just that simple. Now this board is 1 inch thick, so I can set it to 1 inch quite easily, just like that. And then I can bring it up to the board, and there it is, flush on the end. That's another handy feature, once again, for transferring measurements. This is handy. When I was creating the plane holder, I used a ruler like this. These stops mounted onto the ruler are very handy to make sure that when you're applying a thin board onto another board, that the board is not being applied warped. And I was having that issue when I was putting together the plane holder that went up onto my French cleat wall. Those 1/4 inch strips that I had cut warped a bit. And so I set up the stop on a ruler like this, and I used that to verify the distance from the other previous stop as I was applying the brad nails into the board to make sure that the board was going in straight and not crooked. And once again, just like the cheap brand, the stop is able to fit onto the top of the ruler, just like that, and then you can use it for doing vertical measurements on the end. If you're trying to scribe a measurement, so for instance, you're trying to make a line that is 1.5 inches long, extending the length of a board, there's a little notch here on the end of the ruler that you're able to put a pencil into, and then you can just push this along the edge of the board and continue that line the length of the board. The Woodpeckers rulers have a little bit of a smoother surface here than the cheaper Violetfox rulers, and so it's more likely that the Woodpeckers rulers are going to stay on target, whereas these may slightly shift while you're moving it along the edge of a board. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about price. The Violetfox 3-piece set of rulers that I bought, I paid $23.19 for these in July 2024 as a set. They're currently at $28.99 on Amazon. So I found that these were handy, and so I decided that I wanted to get the real thing, and so I bought the Woodpeckers stainless steel rulers also when they went on sale. And because I found that the Violetfox rulers were handy, I also bought the Woodpeckers stainless steel rulers when they went on sale on Amazon. I paid $139.99 in October 2024. They're currently listed at $169.99. Now that price is kind of high, especially if you're only using them for the ruler functions. However, if you're able to incorporate the stop block functionality into the ruler, then it becomes a much more useful tool. Whether or not it's worth $139.99 or $169.99 is up to you to decide. You may find that these Violetfox rulers, which are a knockoff of the Woodpeckers rulers, are sufficient for you. Just make sure that you make note of which of the measurements on your rulers are not accurate so that you don't use those measurements in your projects. Okay, that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.